Inside the study room, Marcus sat at the wooden desk, his school books scattered before him, but his eyes were not on the pages in front of him. His mind had drifted far away, lost in a thought that made his chest tighten and his palms grow warm. The sound of footsteps echoed from down the hallway. Marcus's body tensed, and he quickly looked down at his textbook, pretending to study the mathematics problems he had already solved 3 times over. The door opened softly, and there she was. Catherine walked into the room with the kind of grace that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. She wore a simple blue dress, but on her, it looked like something more beautiful than any expensive gown. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and there was a gentleness in her eyes that always made Marcus forget how to speak properly. Catherine was 28 years old, and she had been Marcus's private tutor for almost 2 years. She was intelligent, kind, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that drew people toward her like moths to a flame. But there was something else about her that Marcus had only recently begun to understand. There was a sadness that lived behind her smile, a loneliness that seemed to echo in the spaces between her words. Her husband, David, was a soldier in the Nigerian army, and he had been away on deployment for 6 months. He would not return for another 6 months, Catherine had told Marcus once, her voice steady but her eyes distant. Marcus was 20 years old now, no longer a boy, but not yet fully a man. He was in his final year of secondary school, preparing for his university examinations. Catherine had been hired by his parents to help him master the subjects that gave him trouble, particularly English literature and advanced mathematics. What his parents did not know was that Marcus had stopped struggling with these subjects months ago. He came to these tutoring sessions not because he needed the help, but because he needed to be near Catherine. He needed to breathe the same air as her, to hear the music of her voice as she explained difficult concepts, to watch the way her hands moved as she wrote on the board. Catherine settled into the chair across from Marcus and pulled out her notebook. She always kept detailed records of his progress, and she took her work very seriously. This was something Marcus respected about her, even as it made his heart ache. She was devoted to her job, to doing things the right way, even when the world around her seemed uncertain and lonely. She glanced at the mathematics problems on his desk and nodded with approval. "You have completed all the questions?" she asked, her voice carrying that soft warmth that made Marcus forget how to think straight. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice coming out quieter than he intended. "I finished them earlier today." Catherine picked up his paper and began to review his work, her eyes moving carefully across each line. Marcus watched her face as she read, noting the small furrow that appeared between her eyebrows when she concentrated deeply. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or fashion. Her beauty came from somewhere deeper, from the strength that lived inside her, from the kindness that seemed to flow from her like an invisible current. "These are all correct," Catherine said after several minutes. She looked up at Marcus with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "You are progressing very well. I think you will do excellently on your examinations." Marcus wanted to tell her that he did not care about the examinations anymore. He wanted to tell her that the only thing he thought about these days was her, that he woke up in the morning thinking about her and fell asleep at night with her name on his lips. He wanted to tell her that the sound of her voice had become his favorite song, that the sight of her smile was worth more to him than any academic achievement. But he said none of these things. Instead, he simply nodded and watched as she began preparing the next lesson. The tutoring session continued for another hour. Catherine taught him about the themes of love and betrayal in classic literature, and Marcus found himself hanging on her every word, though he barely heard what she was saying. His entire world had narrowed down to the space between them, the desk that separated them, the invisible thread that seemed to connect them when their eyes met for just a moment too long. As the session ended, Catherine began gathering her materials. She stood up from her chair and walked toward the bookshelf, searching for a reference book she wanted to show Marcus. She stood on her toes to reach for it, stretching upward, and in that moment Marcus felt something shift inside him. It was as if a wall that he had built inside his chest suddenly cracked, and all the feelings he had been holding back began to pour through. His hands trembled as he stood up, and his heart pounded so fiercely that he thought it might break through his ribs. Catherine turned around with the book in her hand, and she saw the expression on Marcus's face. She paused, noticing something in his eyes that made her own breath catch. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to crackle with an electricity that neither of them could deny. Catherine's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at the book in her hands as if it held the answer to a question she had been asking herself for months. "Marcus," she said softly, and the way she spoke his name made it sound like a confession. "I think we should continue with the literature work. There is so much more to cover before your examinations." But Marcus heard something different in her words. He heard hesitation. He heard fear. And beneath those things, he heard something that made his heart soar and crash at the same time. He heard the echo of his own feelings reflected back at him, trapped behind the walls of propriety and responsibility that kept them both trapped. The rain continued to fall outside the study window, and in that suspended moment, with the sound of water drumming against the glass, Marcus realized that they had reached a point of no return. The line between teacher and student, between appropriate and forbidden, seemed to be growing thinner with each passing day. And as Catherine turned away from him, hugging the book to her chest as if it were a shield, Marcus knew that soon, very soon, one of them would find the courage to cross that line. The question was not if they would, but when, and what would happen when they did. 3 days had passed since that moment in the study room, 3 days that felt like an eternity, stretched thin and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Marcus moved through his life like a ghost, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. He attended school, sat through his classes, spoke when spoken to. But his consciousness lived in a different place entirely. It lived in the memory of Catherine's face when she looked at him that afternoon, in the space between heartbeats where he had felt something fundamental shift in the universe. He had not seen her since. His mother had mentioned that Catherine had sent a message saying she was unwell and would need to take a week off from tutoring. Marcus knew this was not true. He knew that Catherine was avoiding him, running from the same current that pulled at him with an intensity that threatened to drown him. The knowledge of her avoidance twisted inside him like a knife, because it told him that she felt it too. She would not run if she did not feel it. That morning, Marcus sat in the kitchen of his family home in the quiet suburb of Leckie, pushing eggs around his plate with a fork. His mother, Patricia, sat across from him, reading the newspaper and sipping her coffee. She was a woman of routine and order, and she noticed when things fell out of place. She had been watching her son with a mother's careful eye, noting the way he seemed diminished, as if something vital inside him had been turned down. Patricia set down her newspaper and studied Marcus over the rim of her coffee cup. She was a perceptive woman, intelligent and intuitive in the way that many mothers are, and she could sense the turbulence in her son's emotions. But she did not yet understand its source. She knew only that something had changed in him, something that went deeper than the typical worries of a young man preparing for his final examinations. "You are not eating," Patricia said, her voice carrying the gentle concern that only a mother can hold in her words. "Is everything well with you, Marcus? You seem distant these past few days." Marcus looked up from his plate and forced a smile that he hoped would convince her that nothing was wrong. He had become skilled at lying since that moment in the study room, at constructing a facade that would keep the world from seeing what was really happening inside him. He was terrified that if his mother looked too closely, she would see the truth written across his face in letters too large to ignore. "I am fine, Mother," he said, his voice steady even as his hands trembled slightly beneath the table. "I am just thinking about my examinations. They are coming soon and I want to do well." Patricia watched him for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face for signs of deception. But a mother's intuition can only take you so far, and she could not know what secrets her son was keeping locked away in the chambers of his heart. She nodded slowly and returned to her newspaper, though Marcus could feel her concern lingering in the air like the ghost of a question unasked. Later that day, Marcus found himself walking through the Leckie Conservation Center, a sprawling nature reserve near his home. The trees rose up around him like silent witnesses, their branches swaying in the warm afternoon breeze. The Lago sun beat down relentlessly, turning the world into a shimmer of heat and light, and yet Marcus barely noticed. His feet carried him forward without conscious direction, as if his body knew where it needed to go even though his mind was lost in a fog of longing and confusion. He had come here hopping to find peace, to escape the suffocating walls of his home and the weight of his own feelings. But peace seemed like a distant dream, something that belonged to other people, to those who had not felt the earth shift beneath their feet when another person looked at them with sudden understanding. He sat down on a wooden bench overlooking a small pond, and he allowed himself to cry silently, the tears streaming down his face while the world around him remained indifferent to his suffering. Marcus thought about Catherine, about the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, about the small touches that had become more frequent over the past months. He thought about how she sometimes looked at him when she thought he was not paying attention, her eyes holding a sadness mixed with something else, something that looked almost like hunger. He wondered if she was suffering too, if she was at home right now feeling the same ache that lived in his chest, the same restless yearning that would not let him rest. That evening, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message. His heart leaped into his throat when he saw the sender's name. It was Catherine. His hands shook as he opened the message, and he read the words with the intensity of someone reading prophecy. Catherine's message was brief but heavy with meaning. She wrote that she had recovered from her illness and would return to tutoring the following week. She wrote that they needed to maintain professionalism and focus on his studies. She wrote these things in simple, clear sentences, but Marcus could read between the lines. He could hear the trembling in her typed words, the effort it took her to maintain distance when she wanted nothing more than to close the space between them. Marcus read the message over and over again, analyzing each word, searching for hidden meanings in the spaces between letters. And then he did something he had never dared to do before. He wrote back to Catherine, not with words of confession, but with a question. He asked her if she was truly well, if there was anything he could do to help her, if she was struggling with something that he could not see. He sent the message before his courage could fail him, and then he waited, his entire being suspended in anticipation. The response came within minutes, and the speed of it told Marcus everything he needed to know. Catherine had been waiting for him to write, had been holding her phone in her hands, ready to answer the moment he reached out. Her message was longer this time, less careful. She wrote that she was tired, that she had been feeling overwhelmed, that the months of her husband's absence had left her feeling untethered and lost. She wrote that she looked forward to resuming their tutoring sessions because seeing Marcus and working with him was one of the few things that brought light into her days. And then, in words that seemed to burn with their own terrible heat, Catherine wrote something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. She wrote that sometimes people come into our lives at the wrong time when we are too vulnerable and they are too young, but that does not make the connection between them any less real. She wrote that she had tried to resist what she was feeling, that she had prayed and meditated and done everything she could think of to push away the magnetic pull she felt toward him. But she confessed that her resistance was crumbling day by day, moment by moment. Marcus sat in his room, the phone trembling in his hands, and he felt something shift inside him. This message was not just a response, it was a confession. It was Catherine letting down the walls she had so carefully constructed, revealing the depth of feeling that had been building inside her just as it had been building inside him. And in that revelation, Marcus understood that they were standing at the edge of a precipice together, that one step forward would send them both tumbling into something beautiful and terrifying and irrevocable. He wrote back to her, his words pouring out without hesitation now. He told her that he understood, that he had felt it too, that every moment away from her felt like a piece of him was missing. He told her that he did not care about the rules that said they should not feel this way, that he did not care about the consequences. All he knew was that being near her had become more necessary to him than breathing. Catherine's response took longer this time, and when it finally came, it was just 2 words. "Next Tuesday," she wrote, referring to the day of their next scheduled tutoring session. And then, in words that seemed to pulse with barely restrained emotion, she wrote, "We need to talk, truly talk, no more pretending." Marcus held the phone to his chest, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and hope that left him gasping. The barrier between them, so carefully maintained for so long, was about to come down. And neither of them seemed capable of stopping it anymore. The question was no longer if something would happen between them, but what would happen when it did, and whether either of them would survive it with their hearts intact. Tuesday arrived like a storm that had been gathering on the horizon for months, inevitable and terrifying in its approach. Marcus woke before dawn that morning, his body thrumming with a nervous energy that made sleep impossible. He lay in the darkness of his room, watching the shadows slowly fade as the Lagos sun began its slow climb into the sky, and he felt as though his entire life was balanced on the edge of a knife. On one side lay the familiar world of safety and rules and propriety. On the other side lay something unknown and dangerous and infinitely more real than anything he had ever experienced. He moved through the morning in a daze, his mind fragmented and scattered like glass shards. His mother made him breakfast, and he sat at the table pushing food around his plate again, the same empty ritual of the past week. His father had left early for work, so it was just the two of them, and Patricia watched her son with an intensity that made Marcus feel as though his secret was written across his skin in visible ink. He wanted to tell her something, anything, to break the suffocating silence that had grown between them. But what could he say? How could he possibly explain the way his heart had become a stranger to his own body, how it beat to a rhythm that belonged only to Catherine? By afternoon, Marcus felt as though he might splinter apart from the pressure building inside him. He dressed carefully, choosing a blue shirt that he hoped made him look older, more capable of handling what was about to unfold. He looked at himself in the mirror and did not recognize the face staring back at him. His eyes were too bright, too desperate, too full of wanting. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff deciding whether to jump. Catherine arrived at 3 o'clock precisely, as she always did. But this Tuesday was different from every other Tuesday that had come before it. She wore a white dress instead of her usual muted colors, and her hair was loose, falling down her back in waves that caught the afternoon light filtering through the windows. There was something defiant in her appearance, as if she had dressed this way intentionally, as if she had made a choice about what was going to happen between them. When she saw Marcus standing in the hallway waiting for her, something flickered across her face, a recognition of the magnitude of the moment they were about to step into. "Hello, Marcus," Catherine said, and her voice carried a tremor that had never been there before. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision and was now living with the consequences of it. "Shall we begin?" But they both knew that this tutoring session would not follow the usual pattern. They moved into the study room, and Catherine closed the door softly behind them. The sound of the door closing seemed to seal them off from the rest of the world, creating a space that belonged only to them. Marcus's heart was pounding so fiercely that he thought Catherine must be able to hear it, must be able to see it visible beneath his shirt like a trapped bird desperate to escape. Catherine set down her bag and turned to face him directly. There was no pretense now, no careful distance between them, no walls constructed from propriety and fear. She looked at him with an openness that made him feel both incredibly seen and deeply afraid of what that seeing might reveal about himself. "I have been thinking about what to say to you all week," Catherine began, her words coming slowly as if she were pulling them from somewhere deep inside herself. "I have rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my head, trying to find the right words, the right way to explain what I am feeling." She paused, and in that pause Marcus could hear the weight of months of loneliness, months of a husband's absence, months of a connection with a young man that had grown too powerful to ignore. But there are no right words for this. There is only honesty. She moved closer to him, and with each step she took, Marcus felt something inside him shift and remake itself. Catherine stopped when there was only a small distance between them, close enough that he could smell the fragrance of her shampoo, close enough to see the vulnerability in her eyes. "I know this is wrong," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that you are my student and I am responsible for maintaining boundaries. I know that I am married, that my husband is serving his country, that I made vows that I promised to keep. I know all of these things, Marcus. But what I also know is that for the first time in my life I feel alive. When I am with you, I feel like the woman I was always meant to be, not the woman I have become." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she spoke, and Marcus watched them fall like they were sacred, like they were proof of something real and true. "My marriage is empty, Marcus. It has been empty for years, even before my husband left. We are two people who have learned to live separately in the same house. He goes to his work, his meetings, his soldiers' gatherings, and I wait at home, watching the days pass, wondering if this is all that life has to offer me. And then you came into my life, and suddenly the world had color again." Marcus listened to every word, and with each confession he felt something breaking open inside him. He realized that Catherine was not just a woman who had been caught in the grip of her own desires. She was a woman who had been drowning, who had been slowly disappearing into the emptiness of her own life, and who had found in him a reason to remember what it felt like to matter, what it felt like to be wanted, what it felt like to be truly seen by another person. "I am not asking you to solve my problems," Catherine continued. "I am not asking you to be my savior or to fill the void that my marriage has left empty. What I am doing is being honest with you about what I feel, because you deserve that honesty. You deserve to know that this is real, that my feelings for you are not some passing fancy or a result of your youth or your availability. I care for you deeply, Marcus. I have tried so hard not to, but I cannot help it." Marcus wanted to speak, but his voice seemed to have abandoned him entirely. There were words inside him, so many words, but they were tangled and desperate and fighting against each other for dominance. He opened his mouth and closed it again, and Catherine waited for him with a patience that spoke volumes about her character, about her understanding of how overwhelming this moment must be for someone so young. "I love you," Marcus finally managed to say, and the words felt too small for the vastness of what he was feeling. "I know that might seem impossible to you. I know that I am young and that what I feel might be dismissed as infatuation or obsession. But this is not that, Catherine, this is something deeper. When I am with you, I feel like I am finally becoming who I am supposed to be. You see me in a way that nobody else ever has." Catherine reached out and took his hand, and the touch of her skin against his felt like coming home after years of being lost. Her hand was trembling, and Marcus could feel the uncertainty in her touch, the weight of the decision she was making by allowing this contact. "If we do this," Catherine said softly, "if we cross this line, there is no going back. Everything will change. We will hurt people who love us. We will put ourselves at risk. Are you prepared for that, Marcus? Are you truly ready for the consequences of what we are about to do?" Marcus looked into her eyes, and he saw not just the woman he had loved from afar for so long, but a person as lost and desperate as he was, as willing to risk everything for the chance to feel something real. He squeezed her hand gently, and in that gesture he answered her question without needing to speak. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were gathering all her strength, all her courage, all the parts of herself that had been splintered and broken by years of emptiness. And then she looked at him again, and in her eyes, Marcus saw the moment she let go of everything she had been trying to hold onto. The teacher, the dutiful wife, the responsible woman who always did the right thing, all of it fell away, leaving only Catherine, raw and vulnerable and achingly human. She reached up and touched his face with her fingertips, tracing the line of his cheekbone with a tenderness that spoke of months of longing. And then she leaned toward him, closing the final distance between them, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like the beginning and the end of everything at once. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but in those suspended moments, time seemed to stretch and fold in upon itself, containing lifetimes of longing and release. When Catherine and Marcus finally pulled apart, they were both trembling, breathing as if they had just emerged from deep underwater, gasping for air after holding their breath past the point of safety. Their foreheads touched, and they stood in that intimate closeness, neither quite ready to break the spell that had fallen over them. Catherine's eyes remained closed, as if opening them would shatter the fragile reality they had created together. A single tear traced down her cheek, and Marcus reached up to catch it with his thumb, his touch so gentle that it seemed to exist at the borderline between real and imagined. In that gesture, there was an apology and a question and a promise all woven together into one moment of profound tenderness. Catherine opened her eyes and looked at him, and in her gaze, Marcus saw the full weight of what they had done, the magnitude of the threshold they had crossed together. "I need to tell you something," Catherine whispered, her voice carrying the quality of a confession made in the darkness of a confessional booth. "I need you to understand what this means for me, what this means about who I am." They moved together to the window seat in the study, where afternoon light spilled across the cushions in golden bands. Catherine sat down slowly, as if her body had become suddenly heavy, weighted down by the emotional burden of honesty. Marcus sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance now, sensing that Catherine needed space to articulate the profound feelings that had broken free inside her. "My marriage has been dying for a long time," Catherine began, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "Not because David is a bad man, he is not. He is honorable and dutiful, and he loves his country with a passion that consumes him entirely. But he does not love me, Marcus, not really. He loves the idea of a wife, the convenience of having someone at home who manages the household, who waits for him, who represents stability in his life. But he has never truly seen me. He has never looked at me the way you do." She paused, and in that pause Marcus could hear the echo of countless lonely evenings, countless nights spent waiting for a husband who chose his work, his friends, his ambitions over the woman who shared his bed. Catherine's voice trembled as she continued, each word seeming to cost her something precious. "When he left for deployment 6 months ago, I felt relief," Catherine admitted, and the confession seemed to break something inside her. She covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. "Can you imagine that, Marcus? Your husband leaves to serve his country, and instead of feeling worry or fear for his safety, all you feel is relief. That was the moment I realized how completely empty my life had become. That was when I understood that I had been slowly disappearing, that the woman I had always wanted to be was being buried under years of disappointment and resignation. Marcus moved closer to her and placed his arm around her shoulders, and Catherine leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. He could feel the trembling that ran through her body, the way her breathing came in shallow gasps as she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her own heartbreak. "And then you began to change," Catherine continued, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Slowly, over months, you began to look at me differently. You started paying attention to the things I said, remembering details about my life that I had only mentioned in passing. You laughed at my jokes. You asked me questions about who I was, what I wanted, what my dreams were. No one had done that in so long, Marcus. No one had made me feel like my thoughts and my feelings and my desires mattered." Catherine sat up and looked at him directly, and Marcus saw in her eyes a mixture of fear and wonder, regret and relief, all swirling together in a tempest of emotion that was uniquely hers. She reached up and placed her palm against his cheek, and the warmth of her touch sent a current of electricity through his entire being. "I know this is complicated," she said softly. "I know that by doing this, by feeling this, I have betrayed promises I made. I have become someone I never thought I would be. But I also know that for the first time in years, I feel like myself again. When I am with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive, to matter, to be wanted not for what I can do or provide, but simply for who I am." Marcus took her hand and pressed it against his heart, letting her feel the rapid beating that spoke of his own overwhelming emotions. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he was willing to bear whatever consequences came from this connection, that for him being with her was worth any price. But before he could speak, they heard a sound that froze them both in place. It was the sound of a car pulling into the driveway outside, the low rumble of an engine cutting off, the mechanical click of a door opening and closing. Both Marcus and Catherine went absolutely still, their eyes locking together in a moment of pure panic. The tutoring session. They had been so lost in each other that they had completely lost track of time. Marcus's father was home from work early, something that happened rarely but not impossibly. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, and Marcus could see the flush rising up her neck, visible evidence of their intimacy written across her skin in a language that anyone could read. They scrambled to compose themselves with the frantic energy of people who had just narrowly avoided disaster. Catherine smoothed down her dress and ran her fingers through her hair, trying to restore some semblance of order to her appearance. Marcus straightened his shirt and moved back to the desk, pulling open his textbooks with shaking hands. But neither of them could erase the electricity that still crackled between them. The way their eyes kept finding each other across the small space of the study room, the way their breathing remained slightly ragged, betraying the intensity of what had just transpired. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the study, and both of them froze. But the footsteps continued past the door, moving toward the master bedroom. Catherine and Marcus released a breath that they had been holding, but the moment of danger had shattered something precious. The spell that had protected them in their own private world had been broken, and now they were forced to confront the reality of their situation, the danger of their secret, the precariousness of the position they had put themselves in. Catherine glanced at her watch and stood up, her movements now careful and controlled, those of a professional maintaining appropriate boundaries. "I think that is enough for today," she said, her voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. "You have done excellent work with the literature analysis. I would like you to continue reviewing these themes for next week." The formality of her words was a shield, a necessary fiction they both clung to as if it could protect them from the magnitude of what they had done. Marcus nodded and began gathering his books, maintaining the pretense of the tutoring session they had abandoned hours ago. But when Catherine passed close to him as she prepared to leave, their hands brushed together, and in that brief contact, an entire conversation happened without words. There was fear and tenderness, apology and desire, all contained in the electricity of skin touching skin for just a moment too long. Catherine left shortly after, making her excuses about needing to prepare dinner at home, about a headache that required rest. Marcus watched her go, his heart aching with a force that felt almost physical, a sharp pain that lived beneath his ribs and refused to be ignored. He heard his father call out a greeting as Catherine passed him in the hallway, heard his father's cheerful response when Catherine returned the greeting with her carefully constructed politeness. That evening, as Marcus sat at the dinner table with his parents, he felt like an imposter in his own life. He moved food around his plate and smiled when appropriate and answered questions when asked, but all the while he was thinking about Catherine, wondering if she was sitting at her own dinner table feeling equally displaced, equally caught between two worlds. He was thinking about the kiss, about the weight of her confession, about the moment when she had allowed him to see the full depth of her loneliness and her desperate hunger for connection. That night in the darkness of his room, Marcus received a text message from Catherine. It was just 3 words, but they contained an entire universe of meaning. "I am sorry," she wrote, though her words carried no actual apology, only the weight of someone acknowledging the irreversible nature of what had happened between them. "But not sorry enough to stop." Marcus read those words over and over, understanding in them the terrible clarity of their situation. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had opened a door that could never be fully closed. And now, like Pandora releasing her mistakes into the world, they were forced to live with the consequences of their choice. The question that haunted Marcus as he finally fell into an uneasy sleep was not whether they would continue, but how long they could hide what was happening before the entire carefully constructed world around them came crashing down. 2 weeks had passed since that afternoon in the study, and in those 14 days, Marcus and Catherine had learned to live double lives with the desperate precision of people walking a tightrope suspended over an abyss. They had constructed an elaborate architecture of lies and carefully timed meetings, of stolen moments and calculated risks, each decision layered with the weight of potential discovery. During their tutoring sessions, they maintained the facade of teacher and student with an almost theatrical precision, their conversations about literature and mathematics punctuated by glances that burned with unspoken intensity, their hands occasionally brushing across the desk as they reviewed his work, each touch a conversation that only they could understand. But it was outside the study, away from the watchful eyes of Marcus's family, that their true relationship bloomed with an intensity that threatened to consume them both. Catherine had begun to make excuses to leave her home in the late afternoons, claiming she needed to visit her mother who lived in another part of Lagos, or that she had to run errands at the market, or that she was meeting with other students. Each lie built upon the previous one, creating a fortress of falsehood that both protected them and imprisoned them simultaneously. Marcus, in turn, had started telling his parents that he was studying at his friend's house, that he had extra revision sessions scheduled, that he needed to visit the library for research materials. The lies had become so frequent, so woven into the fabric of their daily existence, that sometimes he forgot where the truth ended and the fabrication began. They met at small hotels in the quieter parts of Lagos, the kind of places where no one asked questions and where the proprietors barely glanced up from their desks as couples checked in. These hotels became their sanctuary, their refuge from the world that would condemn them if it knew the truth. In those small rooms, with the afternoon light filtering through thin curtains and the sound of Lagos traffic humming like a distant heartbeat outside, they allowed themselves to become fully present with each other, to shed the careful masks they wore in public, and simply exist as two souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. Catherine would arrive first always, entering through the back entrance so as to minimize the chance of being seen by anyone who might recognize her. Marcus would wait 30 minutes before following, maintaining the appearance of coincidence should anyone happen to notice his movements. In the room, they would fall into each other's arms with the hunger of people who had been starving, their kisses and touches speaking volumes about the deprivation they endured every moment they were apart. What surprised Marcus most was not the physical intimacy between them, though that was profound and overwhelming in its own right. What surprised him was the vulnerability that Catherine revealed in those private moments, the way she would lie with her head on his chest and whisper stories about her childhood, her dreams. The young woman she had been before life had worn her down into something diminished and cautious. She spoke about her ambitions to write, confessing that she had always wanted to be a novelist but had abandoned that dream when she married David, when she had accepted the role of dutiful wife and manager of a household. She spoke about the silence that existed between her and her husband, a silence so profound that sometimes whole days would pass with them speaking only the most basic pleasantries required for functioning in shared space. Marcus listened to every word as if they were sacred texts, as if her confessions were the most important truths he had ever heard. He held her close and told her that she was brilliant, that her words were beautiful, that her dreams mattered. He made love to her with a tenderness that spoke of his understanding of her pain, his desire to heal wounds that had been carved into her soul by years of emotional abandonment. In those moments of connection, he felt like he was both giving her something precious and receiving something equally precious in return, that they were engaged in a sacred exchange that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human interaction. But underneath the sweetness of their connection ran a current of terror, a constant trembling awareness of how precarious their situation truly was. Catherine was married. Marcus was barely an adult. The age difference between them, which felt inconsequential in the moments when they were lost in each other's arms, took on monstrous proportions when they emerged back into the world. They were living in constant fear of discovery, aware that a single wrong word, a single slip in their careful facade could unravel everything and destroy multiple lives in the process. One afternoon, as they lay together in one of their hidden rooms, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message. She reached over to check it, and Marcus watched her entire body go rigid, watched the color drain from her face like water from a cracked vessel. She sat up slowly, her movements suddenly stiff and mechanical, and Marcus felt his stomach drop with an instinctive knowledge that something was very wrong. "What is it?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer, could feel it in the sudden shift of the air between them, the way the light in Catherine's eyes had gone cold and distant. Catherine's voice when she spoke was hollow and barely audible. "David is coming home," she whispered, the words seeming to come from somewhere far away, from a place deep within her that had been frozen by the shock of the message. "He is coming home tomorrow. His deployment ended early. There was an accident at the camp and they are rotating personnel. He will be here by evening." The words hung between them like a death sentence, final and irrevocable. Marcus felt the entire world tilt and shift beneath him, felt the ground opening up to swallow them both into an abyss from which there was no escape. David, the soldier they had been able to ignore because of his distance, because he existed only as an abstraction in their carefully constructed reality, was suddenly becoming real and present and imminent. Catherine's hands began to tremble and Marcus gathered her into his arms, feeling her body shake with a fear that was so profound it seemed to rattle through her bones. She wept silently against his chest and Marcus held her, rocking her gently back and forth as if she were a child who had been frightened by thunder. He wanted to tell her that everything would be all right. That they would find a way through this, that their love was strong enough to survive anything. But he could not lie to her, not about something this important, not about the crushing reality of what her husband's return meant for both of them. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, his voice barely stronger than Catherine's had been. "We cannot just pretend this never happened. I cannot pretend that I do not love you. I cannot go back to being just your student." Catherine pulled away from him and walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were trying to hold together the pieces of herself that were threatening to scatter. She stood there for a long time, staring out at the Lagos skyline, at the sprawl of buildings and streets, and the millions of lives being lived in this vast city. All of those lives continuing on with their ordinary concerns, while hers was being torn apart by the collision of two irreconcilable realities. "We have no choice," Catherine finally said, her voice steady but filled with a grief so profound that it seemed to bend the very air around her. "When David comes home, everything has to end. We have to return to the way things were. You have to stop coming to my home. I have to maintain the appearance of a faithful wife. We cannot see each other outside of the tutoring sessions, and even those will have to change. We will have to be careful, so careful, to never let anyone see what we feel." Marcus felt as if his heart was being torn from his chest. The thought of being separated from Catherine, of watching her every day and being unable to touch her, unable to speak freely to her, unable to exist in the world together as they truly were, seemed like a form of torture more cruel than any physical pain he had ever experienced. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "How long do we have to be apart?" Catherine turned to look at him, and in her eyes Marcus saw the reflection of his own anguish, magnified and multiplied by the weight of her responsibility, by the choices she had made years ago that had led her into this impossible situation. She walked back to him and took his face in her hands, and she kissed him with a desperation that spoke of someone saying goodbye to the only thing that had ever made her feel alive. "I do not know," Catherine whispered against his lips. "I do not know how long this will last or if we will ever be able to have this again. But this much I know with absolute certainty, Marcus. What you and I have found together, what we have become to each other in these weeks, is the truest thing that has ever happened to me. I will carry you with me for the rest of my life, even if I can never touch you again. You will always be my greatest love and my greatest regret, and I am sorry for that, so deeply sorry for putting you through this pain." They spent the remainder of that afternoon in a state of bittersweet intensity, making love with the knowledge that they were counting down the hours until their world would be torn apart. Every touch was an etching into memory, every whispered word a prayer to hold onto what they were losing. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, they dressed in silence and prepared to return to their separate lives, knowing that everything was about to change, and that the life they had briefly shared would soon exist only in the quiet chambers of their hearts. David returned to Lagos on an evening when the sky seemed to weep, rain falling from clouds so heavy and gray that they blocked out the dying light of the sun. He arrived at his house at 6:30, pulling into the driveway in a military vehicle, his khaki uniform still dusty from travel, his face weathered and drawn from months spent away from the comforts of home. Catherine heard the sound of the car from where she stood in the kitchen, and every muscle in her body seemed to freeze as if she had turned to stone in an instant. The wooden spoon she was using to stir the pot of soup slipped from her fingers and clattered into the liquid with a soft splash that sounded like a cry of warning in the sudden silence of her awareness. She stood motionless for a moment, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Her heart was racing so fiercely that she thought it might break through her ribs, and she could feel her breath coming in shallow gasps that made her lightheaded and slightly disoriented. She forced herself to take a deep breath, to smooth down her dress, to arrange her face into an expression of pleasant neutrality, the mask of a dutiful wife welcoming home her absent husband. But underneath that carefully constructed expression, Catherine's entire world was collapsing, was being compressed into a small, suffocating space where there was no room for the truth, no space for the woman she had become, no possibility of existing as the person Marcus had taught her to be. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Catherine watched as he took in the scene with eyes that had seen things she could not imagine. Things that had marked him in ways that went deeper than the surface of his sun-darkened skin. He looked older than she remembered, as if the months away had added years to his face, carving deep lines around his mouth and across his forehead. His eyes held a weariness that spoke of things he could not share, of experiences that had fundamentally altered something essential within him. "Catherine," David said, and his voice carried the roughness of disuse, as if he had not spoken a personal word to anyone in months. "I did not expect to see you. I thought you would be out with your students." The lie came easily to Catherine, smoothly and without hesitation, as if the weeks of deception had trained her in this particular art. She moved toward him with the warmth that was expected, and when she embraced him, she felt like a ghost moving through the motions of a life that no longer belonged to her. His uniform was rough against her cheek, and she could smell the scent of diesel fuel and the metallic tang of military life, odors so foreign to her that they seemed to belong to a stranger rather than to the man she had married all those years ago. "My last student canceled," she said, pulling back to look at him, searching his face for some sign of suspicion, some indication that he could see through her carefully constructed performance. But David's gaze was distant and unfocused, the gaze of someone who had returned physically but whose mind remained trapped in another place. "I was just preparing dinner. You must be exhausted." David nodded slowly, as if even this small gesture required more energy than he possessed. He set down his military bag and collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, his body seeming to deflate under the weight of his own exhaustion. Catherine continued preparing dinner with movements that felt mechanical and hollow, each action performed by a body whose consciousness was elsewhere, trapped in stolen hotel rooms and whispered confessions, held fast in the arms of someone she could no longer touch. The evening unfurled with agonizing normalcy. They ate dinner together in the dining room, and David spoke about his deployment in a voice that was measured and careful, as if he were reading from a script. He talked about the heat, the endless drills, the difficulties of maintaining discipline among soldiers who were as tired and homesick as he was. Catherine listened and made appropriate responses, asked the questions that were expected of her, played the role of an attentive wife returning to her husband after months of separation. But all the while, her mind was screaming, her heart was fracturing, her entire being was straining against the bonds of this performance, desperate to break free, to run, to find her way back to the only place where she had ever felt truly alive. That night, when David reached for her in bed, Catherine felt as if her body belonged to someone else entirely, as if she were observing the intimate exchange from a distance, watching another woman moving with mechanical compliance beneath a man she had promised to love but had somehow stopped knowing somewhere along the way. The experience was hollow and suffocating, a betrayal so profound that tears streamed silently down Catherine's face in the darkness, tears that David attributed to the joy of his return rather than the agony of her own captivity. In the days that followed, Catherine existed in a state of profound disconnection, moving through her household duties with the precision of an automaton, while her true self remained frozen in the final moments before David's return. She canceled Marcus's tutoring sessions under the pretense of personal matters, and when he desperately texted her asking what was happening, asking if they could see each other, asking if she still loved him, Catherine found herself unable to respond. Any message she sent could be discovered, any word she wrote could become evidence of her infidelity, so she maintained a silence so complete that it felt like drowning, like pressing her hand over her own mouth to prevent herself from screaming. Marcus experienced those days as a waking death, a slow evisceration of his soul that left him hollow and aching. He returned to school where he moved through the hallways in a fog of despair, his teachers noting his absence of attention, his friends remarking on his sudden withdrawal from their usual gatherings and conversations. He could not eat, he could not sleep, he could not focus on anything except the aching void that Catherine's absence had carved into his chest. He checked his phone obsessively, hopping for messages that never came, creating elaborate fantasies in which Catherine somehow found a way to contact him, to tell him that everything would be all right, that they would find a solution to their impossible situation. One morning, nearly a week after David's return, Marcus received a single text message from Catherine. It contained only 5 words, but those words contained an entire universe of longing and resignation and unbearable pain. "I cannot do this anymore," Catherine wrote. "I am sorry." Marcus read those words over and over, feeling each letter like a blade cutting into his heart. He tried to respond, tried to beg her to reconsider, tried to convince her that they could find a way through this darkness together. But Catherine's phone had been turned off, or she had simply decided not to read his messages anymore. The silence that followed that final text message was so profound, so overwhelming in its completeness, that Marcus felt as if the entire world had been drained of color and sound, leaving him suspended in a gray void where nothing mattered anymore. At home, Catherine moved through the rituals of her marriage with a woman's body that had become a prison for her soul. She performed the duties expected of her, maintained the appearance of a reconciled wife, smiled when appropriate, and maintained silence when necessary. But inside, she was fragmenting into pieces, each piece a memory of Marcus, a stolen moment, a whispered confession of love. She would catch herself staring out windows, lost in reverie, and David would have to call her name multiple times before she returned to the present moment. She found herself making mistakes in simple tasks, forgetting where she had put things, losing track of time while sitting alone in the garden, her mind playing and replaying the weeks she had spent with Marcus like a record stuck on a single heartbreaking refrain. One afternoon, as Catherine sat on the porch of her home watching the rain fall in silver sheets across the yard, David approached her with a softness in his expression that she had not seen in years. He sat beside her without speaking, and together they watched the rain in silence. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to hope that perhaps he had become someone new, that perhaps the months away had changed him, that perhaps they could rebuild something together. But when David spoke, his words shattered that fragile hope into fragments. "I know something is wrong," David said quietly, his eyes fixed on the rain. "I do not know what it is, but I can feel it. You are distant from me, Catherine. You are here, but you are not here. Tell me what troubles you." Catherine's breath caught in her throat, and she felt all the color drain from her face. She wanted to confess everything, to tell him about Marcus, about the months of deceit, about the affair that had awakened her to a version of herself she had thought lost forever. But the words refused to come. Instead, she reached over and took David's hand, and in that gesture was contained all the confusion and pain and impossible complexity of her situation. All the love she felt for her husband tangled impossibly with the consuming passion she felt for a man she could no longer see. Catherine did not answer David's question that afternoon on the porch. Instead, she sat in the rain-soaked silence, her hand trembling in his, unable to speak the truth that lived like a scream trapped behind her teeth. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to confess the affair that had bloomed in the emptiness he had left behind, wanted to explain that in choosing to love Marcus, she had not been rejecting him so much as choosing to save herself from the slow suffocation of their marriage. But the words remained locked inside her chest, buried beneath layers of fear and guilt, and the terrible knowledge that speaking them would destroy not just her life but the lives of everyone she loved. David waited for her to speak, and in that waiting, Catherine could feel him constructing explanations, building theories about what might be troubling her. He probably thought she was worried about money, or that she was struggling with loneliness during his absence, or that she had developed some minor ailment that was causing her distress. He could not possibly imagine the truth, could not fathom the depth and breadth of her betrayal, because in the world David inhabited, the world of military discipline and honor and duty, such things did not happen. In David's world, wives remained faithful and marriages endured, and people kept their promises no matter the cost to their own souls. "I have been worried about my mother," Catherine finally whispered, the lie emerging smoothly from lips that had become too practiced at deception. "She has been ill. It troubles me greatly." David's expression softened immediately, and he reached over to pull his wife close, drawing her against his chest in a gesture meant to comfort. Catherine allowed herself to sink into his embrace, breathing in the scent of the rain and the particular odor that belonged to David alone, a scent she had once loved but which now felt like the fragrance of a stranger. She closed her eyes and permitted herself a single moment of surrendering to his presence, allowing him to believe that his nearness was enough to soothe her troubled heart. But underneath this performance, Catherine's soul continued to fracture, to splinter into pieces that would never fit back together in the same way again. In the weeks that followed David's return, Catherine existed in a state of profound compartmentalization, dividing herself into segments that could not acknowledge each other's existence. The part of her that was David's wife maintained the appearance of a woman adjusting to her husband's return, gradually warming to him as the shock of his arrival faded, and the routines of married life reasserted themselves. The part of her that belonged to Marcus remained frozen in time, suspended in the memory of their final afternoon together, replaying those moments with the obsessive precision of someone trying to memorize a beloved face before being forced to forget it forever. She threw herself into the management of her household with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if she could somehow clean away the stains of her infidelity through the sheer force of domestic labor. She organized the kitchen cabinets, reorganized them, and organized them again. She scrubbed the floors until her hands bled, and when David asked her why she was working so hard, she told him she was simply happy to have him home, happy to be able to focus on being a proper wife again. The lie tasted like ash on her tongue, but she swallowed it down and continued moving through the motions of her life like an actress performing the same tired script night after night. What Catherine did not know was that Marcus, in his desperation and his anguish, had begun his own surveillance of sorts. He would ride his bicycle through Catherine's neighborhood in the late afternoons, hopping for a glimpse of her, for some sign that she was still alive, that she still existed somewhere in the world beyond the void she had created by cutting him off completely. He would position himself on a street corner near her house and watch as she moved about her garden or appeared at windows, these brief sightings all that remained of their once-consuming connection. It was pathetic and obsessive and entirely beneath his dignity, but Marcus no longer cared about dignity. He cared only about the possibility of seeing her, of knowing that she was real and not simply a phantom conjured by his own grief-stricken mind. One afternoon, Catherine happened to glance out her kitchen window and saw Marcus standing beneath a tree across the street, his gaze fixed on her house with an intensity that made her breath catch. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment all the careful compartmentalization that Catherine had constructed came crashing down. She saw in his face the full extent of his suffering, saw the hollowness that had carved itself into his features, saw the desperate need in his eyes that mirrored her own. Before she could think about the consequences, before she could rationalize or reconsider, Catherine moved. She excused herself from the kitchen where David was reviewing some paperwork, telling him she needed to visit the neighbor to borrow a particular spice for the evening meal. Within minutes, she had slipped out of the house and was walking quickly toward the spot where Marcus waited, her heart pounding so fiercely she thought her ribs might crack under the force of it. When she reached him, they did not embrace or kiss. Instead, they simply stood facing each other, separated by a distance that felt both impossibly vast and insignificantly small. "You cannot be here," Catherine whispered, though she made no move to send him away. "If David sees you, if anyone sees us together, everything will be discovered." Marcus reached out and took her hand, and the simple contact sent a current of electricity through Catherine's entire being. She had not realized how desperately she had missed the feel of his touch, how her body had been starving for this connection in the weeks of their separation. His hand was trembling, and she could feel the rapid pulse at his wrist, the physical manifestation of the emotional turbulence that consumed him. "I cannot stay away from you," Marcus said, his voice raw with an emotion so profound that it seemed to strip away the very atmosphere around them. "I have tried, Catherine. I have tried so hard to accept what happened, to move on with my life, to pretend that you do not exist. But I cannot do it. Every moment without you feels like I am dying slowly, like my heart is being extracted from my chest piece by piece." Catherine's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks without her permission. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same way, that every moment with David felt like a betrayal of everything she had discovered in those weeks with Marcus, that she was suffocating under the weight of the life she had returned to. But before she could speak, she heard David's voice calling her name from somewhere in the distance. Her entire body went rigid with terror. "I have to go," she whispered urgently, attempting to extract her hand from Marcus's grip. But he held fast, his eyes pleading with her, silently begging her not to abandon him again. "When can I see you again?" Marcus asked desperately. "Catherine, I cannot live like this. I cannot survive on glimpses and stolen moments. Tell me there is hope. Tell me we will find a way." Catherine's heart was breaking even as it was racing with panic. She glanced back toward her house where David's voice came again, closer now, calling her name with increasing impatience. She looked back at Marcus, at this young man who had awakened something in her that she had thought dead, and she saw the reflection of her own impossible situation mirrored in his desperate gaze. "I do not know," Catherine said, her words coming in gasps as if she were being strangled by the weight of her own conflicted emotions. "I do not know if we can ever be together again, Marcus. David suspects something. He is watching me more carefully now. And you are so young and you have your entire life ahead of you. You cannot waste it on me on this impossible situation." "You do not get to decide that for me," Marcus said fiercely, his voice tight with anguish. "You taught me what love is, Catherine. You showed me what it feels like to truly see another person and be seen in return. You cannot simply erase that and expect me to go back to being the person I was before I knew you." David's voice came again, much closer now, and Catherine knew she was running out of time. She pulled her hand free from Marcus's grip and took a step backward, though it felt like tearing away a part of herself. "Do not come back here," she said, though the words felt like poisoned arrows, hurting her as much as they hurt him. "If David sees you, if there is any connection between us, he will know. Everything will be destroyed, Marcus. Do you understand? Please, I am begging you. Let me go." She turned and began walking back toward her house, forcing herself not to look back, though every fiber of her being screamed to turn around and run back into Marcus's arms. She reached the gate of her home just as David emerged from the front door, his expression puzzled as he looked for her on the street. Catherine painted a smile on her face and waved, explaining that the neighbor had been in the garden and they had talked longer than she expected. David accepted this explanation without question, and he ushered her back into the house, back into the prison of her own life. That night, as Catherine lay beside her sleeping husband, she wept silently, her entire body racked with sobs that she muffled against the pillow so David would not hear. She had seen Marcus's face when she turned away from him. Had seen the devastation and betrayal that flooded his eyes when she told him to leave her alone. She had added another layer of scar tissue to wounds that were still raw and bleeding, and the weight of that cruelty, necessary though it had been pressed down upon her like a stone, threatening to crush her completely. She wondered if this was her punishment, if this was what she deserved for the choices she had made, for the promises she had broken, for the love she had found in forbidden places. And underneath that thought ran another, darker one. She wondered if either she or Marcus would ever be able to escape the prison they had created together, or if they would remain trapped forever in the wreckage of their impossible love. 3 weeks after their chance meeting on the street, the careful facade that Catherine and David had constructed began to crumble like ancient stone worn away by centuries of wind and rain. David had always been observant, a skill honed by years of military discipline and the necessity of reading men's intentions in fleeting glances and subtle body language. But now that watchfulness turned inward toward his own wife. He noticed the way she moved through their home as if she were walking underwater, the manner in which her eyes would drift to distant places when he spoke to her, the tremor in her voice when she mentioned going out on errands that seemed increasingly frequent and increasingly vague about their purpose. One evening, David came home earlier than expected, his deployment having been shortened by administrative requirements. He found the house empty, and a coldness bloomed in his chest, spreading like frost across morning glass. Catherine had told him she would be home preparing dinner, that she had no plans beyond that. He waited in the living room, his jaw clenching with an emotion he could not quite name, an intuition born of years spent in environments where danger often announced itself through absence rather than presence. When Catherine finally returned an hour and a half later, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled, David felt something fundamental break inside him. She saw him sitting there in the growing darkness, and he watched as the color drained from her face, watched as her body seemed to deflate under the weight of being caught. "Where were you?" David asked, his voice dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that speaks of storms gathering behind a calm surface. Catherine's mouth opened and closed several times without sound emerging, like a fish cast upon dry land, suffocating in an atmosphere it was never meant to breathe. She set down her purse with trembling hands and moved toward him, searching his face for some hint of what he knew, what he suspected, how much danger she was truly in. "I went to the market," Catherine said, but the lie was transparent, fractured at the edges, collapsing under the weight of her husband's gaze. "I needed some things for tomorrow's meal." David stood and walked toward her, and Catherine instinctively took a step backward. He had never raised a hand to her, had never been violent in any way, but there was something in his bearing now that spoke of a man whose foundations had been shaken, who was struggling to maintain his grip on a reality that was suddenly shifting beneath his feet. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, and Catherine felt tears spill from her eyes without her permission, without her understanding, as if her body was confessing truths that her voice refused to utter. "I know you are lying to me," David said softly, and the gentleness of his tone was somehow more terrifying than any accusation could have been. "I have known for weeks that something is wrong. I can see it in the way you look at me, Catherine. I can see it in the way you look away. Tell me what is happening." "Tell me the truth." Catherine wanted to confess everything in that moment, wanted to empty herself of all the secrets and lies that had accumulated in her chest like sediment in still water. She wanted to tell him about Marcus, about the months of longing and connection, about the way Marcus had made her feel alive in a way that David, despite his best intentions, had never been able to. She wanted to explain that her infidelity was not a reflection of anything he had failed to provide, but rather a reflection of something she had discovered within herself, something that had been waiting to be awakened all along. But before she could speak, David's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his expression shifted, the intensity of the moment fragmenting under the demands of duty. He answered the phone with a voice that became immediately formal and professional, the voice of a soldier returning to his role. He listened for a moment, and then he told Catherine he needed to return to the military headquarters, that there had been a situation requiring his immediate attention. Within 10 minutes, he had changed into his uniform and was preparing to leave, pausing at the door to look back at her one final time. "We will talk about this when I return," David said, his voice carrying a promise and a threat intertwined so tightly that they could not be separated. "There are things that need to be explained, Catherine. There are questions that need to be answered, and I expect to receive nothing but the truth from you." Catherine stood alone in the suddenly vast emptiness of her home, and she felt the last fragile threads holding her together begin to unravel with a terrible inevitability. She knew that she could not lie her way through another confrontation, that David would see through any deception she attempted, that the time of hiding was finally coming to an end. She moved to the window and looked out at the Lagos Street, at the life continuing on outside with its ordinary concerns and predictable rhythms, and she wondered if she would ever be able to exist in that ordinary world again. She pulled out her phone with hands that felt disconnected from her own body, and she typed out a message to Marcus with the urgency of someone sending a final letter from a sinking ship. "David knows something is wrong," she wrote. "He is going to demand answers when he returns. I do not know how long I can protect you, protect us. Please, you have to stop watching the house. You have to disappear from my life completely. If he discovers your involvement, if he learns that you are the one, I cannot protect you from what will happen." Marcus's response came within seconds, his desperation pulsing through the digital connection like an electric current. "I cannot live without you," he wrote. "I cannot pretend that you do not exist. Tell him the truth, Catherine, tell him about us. We cannot keep living like this, hiding in shadows, breaking ourselves apart piece by piece." But Marcus did not understand that there were realities in the world that did not bend to the desires of young love. That there were consequences that could not be wished away or overcome through the sheer force of feeling. He did not understand that in the world Catherine inhabited, A woman's infidelity was not simply a breach of marriage vows, but a fundamental betrayal of family honor, of social standing, of everything that held a woman's place in society together. He did not understand that David, for all his apparent gentleness, came from a culture and a tradition where such things were handled not through conversation and compromise, but through action and consequence. That night, Catherine sat alone in her darkened bedroom and contemplated the ruins of her life. She thought about the woman she had been before Marcus, cautious, careful, resigned to a comfortable numbness that passed for contentment. She thought about the woman she had become during those stolen weeks with him, alive, passionate, fully present in her own existence. And she wondered which version of herself would survive what was coming, or if perhaps the collision between those two versions of Catherine would destroy her completely, leaving nothing but a hollow shell wearing her skin. She spent the hours waiting for David's return, composing and recomposing explanations in her mind, each one more impossible than the last. She could tell him the truth and hope that his love for her would be strong enough to survive the betrayal. She could lie and hope that somehow, mysteriously, the situation would resolve itself. She could run, abandon her marriage, her reputation, her entire life, and attempt to build something new with Marcus, knowing that she had nothing left to offer him but her broken heart and a future built on the ruins of her past. By the time David's car pulled into the driveway near midnight, Catherine had reached a state of such profound numbness that she could barely feel her own heartbeat. She heard him enter the house, heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard him climbing the stairs toward their bedroom. When he opened the door and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed in the darkness, waiting for him like a prisoner awaiting judgment, something in his expression cracked, and she saw the full depth of his pain reflected back at her, a pain so profound that it threatened to consume them both. "There is someone else, is there not?" David asked, and his voice was hollow, scraped raw by the effort of asking the question he already knew the answer to. "That is what I feel when I am near you, Catherine. That is what I see in your eyes. You are in love with someone else." Catherine's silence was answer enough. David moved to the window and stood there, his back to her, his shoulders seeming to carry the weight of mountains. And in that moment, with the Lagos night pressing against the glass and the sound of distant traffic humming like a dirge, Catherine realized that the life she had known was coming to an end. There would be no returning to the comfortable numbness of before, no pretending that the past weeks had never happened, no continuing to live in the delicate balance between two worlds that could not possibly coexist. "I need to know who it is," David finally said, still facing the window, still unable to look at his wife. "I need to know the name of the man you have chosen over your marriage, over the vows you made to me." Catherine's breath came in short gasps as she contemplated revealing Marcus's identity, knowing that in doing so she would be setting in motion a series of events that would destroy not just her own life but the lives of everyone she loved. She opened her mouth to speak, to finally end this torture through confession, when suddenly they heard a sound that froze them both in place. It was the sound of a car in the driveway, the sound of doors opening and closing, the sound of voices approaching the house. And within minutes, the doorbell began to ring with an insistence that spoke of urgency and authority. The doorbell continued its insistent ringing, a sound that seemed to tear through the fragile membrane separating Catherine and David from the rest of the world. David stood frozen at the window, his silhouette black against the pale glow of the Lagos night, while Catherine remained perched on the edge of the bed like a bird caught in a cage, waiting to see if the door would hold or if the walls would finally come crashing down around them. The ringing stopped for a moment, and in that silence they could hear voices outside, raised in urgent conversation, and then the distinctive sound of the front door being opened without permission, without invitation, as if those who entered had every right to do so. David moved first, leaving the bedroom with measured steps that spoke of a soldier returning to duty, to purpose, to the clear structures of military hierarchy and protocol. Catherine followed behind him, drawn by a compulsion she did not fully understand, her body moving despite her mind's desperate desire to remain hidden, to retreat into the sanctuary of denial. On the stairs, she could see through the open front door to where two military police officers stood in her living room, their uniforms crisp and their expressions grim with the weight of whatever news they had brought. One of the officers stepped forward and saluted David with the respect due to a superior officer. And in that moment, Catherine understood with a sickening clarity that something had happened, something beyond the scope of her own betrayal and infidelity. The officer's words came in a formal cadence that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space, as if he were reading from a script written in a language that belonged to tragedy alone. "Colonel David Okonkwo," the officer said, his voice carrying the mechanical precision of someone delivering unwelcome news that had been rehearsed one too many times. "We have come to inform you of an incident that occurred this evening at the residence of Marcus Adami. The young man attempted to. There was an accident. We are still investigating the circumstances, but his family has requested your presence, sir. As a student's tutor, they believe you may have information that could be relevant to our investigation." The world seemed to tilt and spin around Catherine, the floor beneath her feet becoming suddenly insubstantial, as if she might fall through it at any moment into some vast and terrible void. The words hung in the air like poisoned fruit, and she felt her breath catch in her throat, felt her knees begin to buckle beneath her. Marcus, the officer had said Marcus, an accident, an investigation. Her mind refused to process the sequence of events, refused to accept that the person she loved more than her own breath might be in danger, might be suffering, might be lost to her forever. "What happened?" Catherine heard herself ask, her voice emerging from a throat that felt raw and abraded, as if she had been screaming internally for hours. "What accident? Is Marcus all right?" David turned to look at his wife with an expression that shifted from confusion to something darker, something that contained within it the accumulation of all the suspicions and doubts that had been building in his chest for weeks. The officer's gaze moved between Catherine and David, and in that moment Catherine could see the moment understanding bloomed in the officer's mind. The moment he began to piece together fragments of information that suddenly aligned into a shape that made terrible sense. "I do not have the specific details," the officer said carefully, his professional composure wavering slightly as he sensed the emotional undercurrents flowing beneath the surface of this household. "But the family found him in his room this evening. He was injured, sir, quite severely. They have taken him to the hospital. The family is asking for anyone who might have information about his state of mind, about whether he had mentioned feeling distressed or troubled." Catherine's legs gave way beneath her, and she found herself sitting down hard on the stairs, the world spinning into fragments around her. Marcus had hurt himself. The words echoed in her mind like a death knell, like the final judgment of a court that had found her guilty of crimes she had not fully understood she was committing. She had sent him away. She had told him to disappear from her life. She had rejected him in front of her home because she was terrified of discovery, and now he was lying in a hospital bed somewhere in Lagos, suffering because of the pain she had inflicted upon him, because of the cruelty that had been necessary but devastating nonetheless. David moved past the officers and climbed the stairs toward Catherine, and when he reached her, he extended his hand to help her to her feet. There was no accusation in his touch, no anger or judgment, only a deep and aching sorrow that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being. He helped her up, and she realized with a shock that he understood now. He knew without her needing to say it. He knew that Marcus was the one, that Catherine had been meeting him, that the young man lying in a hospital bed somewhere in this vast city had been the repository of her affection, her passion, her desperate hunger for something that their marriage could not provide. "We need to go to the hospital," David said quietly, and there was something in his voice that spoke of a man whose world had been fractured but who was choosing in this moment to prioritize compassion over his own pain. "We need to see if we can help. We need to understand what happened." The drive to the hospital was a journey through a landscape that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. Catherine sat in the back seat of David's car, wrapped in a blanket of shock and terror so profound that it seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human experience. She wanted to speak, to explain, to confess everything that she had done, but the words remained trapped inside her, building pressure in her chest until she thought her ribs might crack under the force of them. David drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel with an intensity that suggested he was channeling all of his pain and confusion into the physical act of controlling the vehicle. When they arrived at the hospital, they were directed to the intensive care unit, where they found Marcus's parents sitting in a small waiting area, their faces etched with the particular devastation that comes from watching your child suffer. Marcus's mother, Patricia, looked up when Catherine and David entered, and her eyes widened as she took in the implications of their presence, of the way Catherine was staring past everyone toward the closed door of her son's hospital room. "He is stable," Patricia said, her voice hollow and exhausted. "The doctors say he took too many pills, that he was trying to, they say it was intentional." Her voice broke on the final words, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if she could somehow push back the reality of what had happened. "I do not understand it. He was such a happy boy. He had so much to live for. Why would he do this to himself?" Catherine felt as though a knife had been driven into her heart and twisted, slowly and deliberately, by hands that belonged to herself and herself alone. She had done this. She had taken this young man's joy and his hope, and she had crushed it beneath the weight of her own needs and desires and desperate hunger for escape from her marriage. She had awakened something in him that his inexperienced heart could not bear, and when she had taken it away, when she had sent him into the darkness alone with nothing but his anguish for company, he had chosen to end the pain in the most final way possible. "May I see him?" Catherine asked, and her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, from the bottom of an ocean, from the depths of a grave. "Please, I need to see him." Patricia looked at Catherine with confusion, but David placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, and something in his expression seemed to convince Marcus's mother to grant the request. Catherine moved through the hospital corridors as if in a dream, her legs carrying her forward even though her mind was screaming for her to turn back, to run, to flee from the consequences of her actions. When she reached Marcus's room and pushed open the door, she was confronted with a sight that shattered the last remaining pieces of her heart into dust. Marcus lay in the hospital bed with machines surrounding him like mechanical sentinels, their steady beeping the only sound in the vast and terrible silence of the room. His face was pale, almost translucent, as if something essential had been drained from him, leaving only a shell of the vibrant young man she had known. His eyes were closed, and beneath them were dark bruises that spoke of sleepless nights, of anguish too profound for rest. Tubes and wires connected him to the machines that were keeping him alive, forcing his damaged body to continue its biological functions even though some essential part of him seemed to have already departed. Catherine approached the bed and reached out with a trembling hand to touch Marcus's face, her fingers brushing across his cheek with a tenderness born of desperate love and overwhelming guilt. She bent down and whispered words that she knew he could not hear, words of apology and confession and love, words that belonged to the space between life and death, between hope and despair. She wept against his shoulder, her entire body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being, from a place so deep and so fractured that she thought she might never be whole again. David appeared in the doorway, and when he saw his wife weeping over Marcus's unconscious form, when he witnessed the depth of her anguish and understood it for what it truly was, something within him seemed to break open as well. He moved into the room and placed his hand on Catherine's shoulder, and together they stood in the presence of the wreckage of their lives, in the presence of a young man who had loved too deeply and been rejected too completely, a young man who had tried to erase the pain by erasing himself. "He will recover," David said quietly, his words carrying both comfort and accusation. "The doctors believe he will make it. He will wake up someday and he will have to live with what he has done, and Catherine, you will have to live with what you have done. We all will." Catherine nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but acknowledge the terrible truth of his words. She had awakened Marcus to love, had shown him what it meant to matter, to be seen, to be cherished. And then she had taken it all away, had left him alone in the darkness with nothing but memories of what they had shared. The consequences of her actions stretched before her like an endless road, and she understood now that she would walk that road for the rest of her life, carrying the weight of Marcus's suffering, the wreckage of David's trust, the destruction of her own heart. In the days that followed, Marcus gradually regained consciousness, his eyes opening to a world that seemed both familiar and utterly transformed by trauma. When he saw Catherine standing beside his bed, tears began to stream silently down his face, and though he could not yet speak, his eyes conveyed everything: the pain, the love, the desperate relief of finding himself still alive, still capable of feeling despite his best efforts to extinguish that feeling forever. Catherine and David began a slow and agonizing journey toward understanding, toward forgiveness, toward some kind of reconstruction of their shattered lives. It was a journey without maps or destinations, a journey that would require them both to examine the deepest parts of themselves, to confront the ways they had failed each other and the ways they had failed Marcus. And as the Lagos rain fell outside the hospital windows, washing the city clean while leaving the stains inside their hearts untouched, they all understood that love, true love, was not always a force for good. Sometimes it was a force that could destroy, that could wound, that could leave scars that would never fully heal. But it was also always undeniably real. If you enjoyed our stories, please hit that like button. It really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you more amazing stories. Also, I'm always curious to know where our beautiful family is watching from. Please drop the country where you're watching from in the comments. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and try to respond to as many as I can.